So it looks like we are going to get to go first here. And the hand is passable. We've got double discard spell into Thoughtseize. So we're definitely going to keep it. We don't have a mana dork or a planeswalker, but hopefully we can get this Goyf to be fairly sizable, and our opponent doesn't have a removal spell for it. Alright, so it looks like we are playing against the Death Shadow deck. We cannot take the Become Immense. This is actually a pretty solid hand from our opponent. 3 creatures, and then the Mutagenic Growth and the Mishra's Bauble. So we could take a Step Links, but our opponent has 2 of them. The Mishra's Bauble is definitely a reasonable choice. I kind of like taking the Mishra's Bauble. It's a bit risky to take that, though. I guess we just take the Nakatl. It's the creature that our opponent can make the biggest without needing more lands. So, gonna try taking the Wild Nakatl here. Not entirely certain that that was the right choice. So I'm expecting to see a Step Links come down here, as well as that Mishra's Bauble. And we know that our opponent has 2 pump spells in hand, Mutagenic Growth and Become Immense. So you look at these 1-land hands and you're like, oh, our opponent only has one land. So while that's true, the hand has a lot of gas in it. And so there's a Thoughtseize. So now the question is, do we play the Goyf this turn, or would we rather make our opponent discard 2 cards and then play the Goyf on for a follow-up? And that decision is pretty close. My inclination, though, is to want to just get the Goyf into play as quickly as possible. Alright, let's go for the Goyf play. We can fetch for a basic swamp here because we're definitely gonna double discard on our next turn and play the Shambling Vent. And I don't expect our opponent... I expect our opponent to have 2 cards for us to be able to discard in hand still on their next turn. It's not 100% certain that that's going to be the case, but I would say it's more likely than not. Now, our opponent could, say, fire off something like a Jataxian Probe and know that we have these 2 discard spells, but I like having our Tarmogoyf at a 4/5. And here's another Step Links. We'll see if our opponent has an additional land or not. It looks like the answer may be that not. So, or that our opponent is sandbagging a land, which is also possible. But, alright, we drew Lingering Souls. With that being said, we're still going to go ahead and make our opponent discard some of these cards here and try to figure out exactly what's going on. We definitely want to be getting in with our Tarmogoyf, but if we're in danger of dying, we may not be able to. So, alright, it looks like our opponent actually picked up 2 copies of Death Shadow, which is interesting because our opponent's actually at 17 right now. So that leads to the question, do we actually want to be attacking our opponent or not? I think we do want to take a Death Shadow because the Mutagenic Growth simply isn't as strong of a card. So we're going to take 1 Death Shadow. And we've got this Thoughtseize still in hand. We could Thoughtseize away 1 Become Immense, 1 copy of Death Shadow. But I think that our safest bet is going to be keeping this Tarmogoyf back to block here. So I kind of like just playing the Shambling Vent and passing, and just kind of waiting and seeing how the game evolves. Our opponent can't play their other Death Shadow because they're not at a low enough life total as of right now. Alright, so this Gitaxian Probe was actually a pretty good draw from our opponent because now they know exactly what's going on. That we do have a Thoughtseize in hand. And this Lingering Souls as well. So I think we actually do want to block here. It may be that our Tarmogoyf gets lost. Our opponent can give a Step Links plus double +2/+2 basically. But we're fine with basically clearing the board away a little bit. We knew that if our opponent drew a fetch land, it would be not the best for us. And our opponent did draw a fetch land. So expect to see the Mutagenic Growth here, most likely. Okay, yep, so there's the Mutagenic Growth. That's going to take care of our Tarmogoyf. But even if we had gotten rid of the Mutagenic Growth, our opponent still would have had the double Become Immense. So we know about the copies of Become Immense in our opponent's hand, and we're just going to have to be very aware of those and hope that our opponent doesn't draw out of this. But, you know, that was a pretty solid turn from our opponent's standpoint. So here we're just going to cast our Lingering Souls and pass back. The Death Shadow, I don't think we need to block it this turn since it's only a 3/3, but there are draws that could just kill us here if we don't block it. So it's definitely a little bit risky. Like if our opponent draws a Mutagenic Growth, for instance. It'll be interesting to see how our opponent elects to attack this turn. It's pretty clear that our opponent has 2 Become Immenses and 1 other spell in hand. If our opponent had a land, that land would have come into play before combat to make these Step Links bigger. So it looks like our opponent is making an attack with everything. That's quite aggressive. The card we would have lost to if we didn't block this Death Shadow is Mutagenic Growth, but I think now that our opponent's attacking with everything, it's more likely that they have the growth. So putting a Spirit in front of a Step Links is mostly a free roll here. And I think we want to also block a Death Shadow with a Spirit. Our opponent can become immense to make the Step Links bigger. If our opponent has mutagenic growth, we would just lose if we don't block the Death Shadow. Alright, let's go ahead and block the Death Shadow. And we'll see what our opponent's got. It's probably just become immense on Step Links. So it does look like our opponent has gone ahead and become immense the Step Links we were blocking. So it'll be interesting to see which two cards our opponent has, but we're definitely going to take a look at them here with the Thoughtseize. Alright, it's actually Temur Battle Rage and Become Immense. So feels like we want to take the Become Immense here, and we'll leave our opponent with that Temur Battle Rage. And we're simply going to also flash back this Lingering Souls and pass the turn with the Abrupt Decay we just drew available to us. And it looks like our opponent is going for the Battle Rage here. But what we can do now is simply Abrupt Decay away this Death Shadow. So that sequence worked out pretty well for us. And now we're actually in a spot where we don't know what that last card that our opponent has in hand is. But we can fire up the Shambling Vent and start trying to get in some damage here. So I actually like attacking with a Spirit and one Shambling Vent. Now it's true that if our opponent has Become Immense, that it's bad for us, but it's not necessarily game over. And we've also already dealt with 2 copies of Become Immense. So there's a fetch land. It's not great news, but we're just going to stick a Spirit in front of a Step Links and take whatever we've got coming to us on this attack. And our opponent is down to 6, so it's definitely a bit of a race here. Alright, well that's unfortunate. Our opponent drew another copy of Temur Battle Rage, so that's actually going to be lethal. It looks like. Yep, okay, so let's go on to game 2. That was a little bit unlucky there right at the end. But we have a lot of options in terms of what we want to be boarding in this matchup. Slaughter Pact is great. We can board in more copies of Thoughtseize. We saw how good the discard was. The Explosives is good. The Warship is pretty good. So we're just going to have to figure out exactly what we can actually afford to take out, since there are a number of cards we want to board in. So we're going to shave on some of our creatures. Cards like Scavenging Ooze, we can afford to take those out. And then some of our slower cards like Painful Truths. I actually like the Planeswalkers for the most part. So because we have more discard in our deck, we can afford to shave, I think, maybe one Noble Hierarch. The Tireless Tracker can come out, and then one copy of Maelstrom Pulse, just because Maelstrom Pulse is a little bit slow. There's also arguments, I think, to taking out Rhinos. I personally like Rhino a lot. I know not everyone does. So, yep, gonna go with this configuration. I think our deck is pretty well lined up against our opponent, and then if we're on the draw for game 3, we can sort of reconfigure the deck a little bit. Alright, let's see what we got here. We're going to keep this. We've got multiple discard spells once again, and hopefully they are a little bit better for us than last game. Definitely going to get a black source here with this fetch land. Alright, so it looks like our opponent's hand consists of 2 creatures, a Swift Spear, and a Step Lynx, and then also Become Immense and Path to Exile. So I think we get rid of the Step Lynx because it represents the most damage here. So we're going to do that. It is true we could potentially have gotten rid of it with Liliana later, but I think we just want to save the damage. And then we can Thoughtseize again next turn. So the Swift Spirit is just... It's not a 4-power threat like Step Lynx. Like, our opponent has 3 lands in hand. Step Lynx is much more easily going to deal us a lot of damage, and is also better with the pump spells. So we can afford to take this hit from this Monastery Swift Spear. There's an Abrupt Decay. But we're just going to go ahead and Thoughtseize once again. Alright, so we see that our opponent didn't draw a whole lot, just another land. So we can play our land and Path to Exile the Swift Spear if we want to, or we can take 1 hit from the Swift Spear. I kind of like taking 1 hit, so we can just get rid of this Become Immense and play this Temple Guard and tap. The reason why I like saving the Path to Exile is in case our opponent has a bigger creature like Hooting Mandrills after sideboard, we might want this as an answer. And by putting our Temple Garden into play tapped, we're potentially saving ourselves some damage. There's another path, so we're just going to pass. It's nice to have a lot of removal against this deck because they're basically only going to beat you by attacking you for a bunch. So we can use the Abrupt Decay here and save the 2 copies of Path. And it looks like our opponent is just forced to pass here. We drew a Warship, which we're a little ways away from being able to take full advantage of. Interestingly, a lot of these Death Shadows don't play any basic lands at all. So this path may just be just simply getting rid of the creature, and our opponent may not be able to get any additional value. But we drew an Inquisition here, so let's go ahead and use it. So we actually see our opponent did pick up a copy of Hooting Mandrills. We cannot take it. There's also a Temur Battle Rage, but I think now it's okay to just get rid of the Path to Exile because we really do need to stick a threat of our own. So we'll see if our opponent actually decides to try to get this Hooting Mandrills into play here or not. So here's a fetch land. It's interesting that our opponent's activating the fetch land so aggressively and has found this basic forest. So this may be two creatures here, the Nacatl and the Mandrills. We're definitely gonna get rid of the Hooting Mandrills, and then we're probably gonna want to get rid of the Nacatl as well. On our next turn, depending on what the draw step gives us. So yeah, our opponent doesn't have anything to search for there. And our draw step is going to be an Overgrown Tomb. So we got a couple options. We could play Liliana, tick it up on the Nacatl. But I think we just want to go ahead and get rid of the creatures as aggressively as possible. So we're just going to go with the Path to Exile line. And then, potentially, if we do draw another land on our turn, we just go ahead and play our Siege Rhino. Alright, this is pretty bad for us. Our opponent drew Traverse the Ulvenwald. So, it'll be interesting to see exactly what our opponent likes to do with it, but it looks like that was simply just to get the fourth card type in the graveyard. Our opponent was not quite Delirium yet, so I wonder if that was really what our opponent wanted to be doing on that turn. But we're just going to go ahead and land a Siege Rhino. And notably, even if our opponent had been able to traverse to fully search for something, Death Shadow would not have been a good option because our opponent was, at the time, still above 13 life. Now, though, we've got our Siege Rhino in play. Things are looking up. And I think we want to just get this Worship into play for insurance, basically. And the next turn we can play the Liliana if we want to. So now our opponent's going to have to be able to get rid of all of our creatures, essentially. And that's just going to be... This fetch land is dead now. It looks like our opponent has drawn all of their lands. Although Death Shadow off the top is pretty good. We know that our opponent's last card is a copy of Temur Battle Rage. But I think this Worship is going to mean that we're pretty stable. Though it's definitely a little bit of a choice in terms of what we want to do here with our Liliana the Last Hope. So we could plus it on the Death Shadow or minus it aggressively. I think I'd prefer actually just minusing it. We could hit a Lingering Souls or just one of our other creatures. And we hit 2 lands. So, just going to pass the turn back here. I still like the spot that we're in, but if our opponent were to find something like a Path to Exile or Dismember for the Siege Rhino, that would be definitely bad. So, interestingly, this Death Shadow is not attacking the Liliana. It's coming straight at our face. We're not going to block. So, it may be that our opponent just wants to basically make us fully on the Worship plan. And that is something that our opponent has the ability to do. So, if our opponent has a removal spell for the Rhino, we do just straight up lose the game here, but it's pretty unlikely that that is the case. So this is going to put us down to 1. So Inquisition of Kozilek, we can fire that off, and we'll see exactly what our opponent's on right now. So it looks like our opponent actually did heal Dismember, and that is gonna do it here. Just a really great series of top decks from our opponent, basically. I think this is quite a good matchup, but it just turned out that, I mean, and the Death Shadow deck is definitely a very strong deck, but I think we got a little bit unlucky there at the end, and if we had just drawn something like a Lingering Souls, our opponent can basically never kill us. But, yep, that's going to do it.